There is a paradox at the heart of the human condition. We long for joy, yet often remain bound to pain. We wish for freedom, yet at times cling tightly to chains that wound us. Many of us have asked in silence, "Why do I hold on to those who hurt me? Why does my heart remain entangled with the very hands that cause it to bleed?" This question is not only personal, but profoundly universal. It echoes in friendships that turn toxic, in families where love and cruelty intertwine, and in romances where passion burns into anguish. To understand this mystery is to peer into the depths of the human psyche, and to bring light into the shadowy regions of our attachments. Today, I want to walk with you through 5 truths that reveal why we cling to those who make us suffer, and how by seeing them clearly, we may begin to choose differently. Familiar pain feels safer than unknown freedom. This statement may sound paradoxical, yet it lies at the core of why so many remain bound to relationships that wound them. Human beings, for all their yearning for transcendence, are profoundly tethered to what they know. The psyche, like a vine, clings to the structures that first gave it shape. Even if those structures were built from cruelty, neglect, or silence, they become the scaffolding upon which the soul learns to grow. To abandon them feels not only terrifying, but almost like abandoning the very self one has always known. Consider the child who grows up in a house of criticism and coldness. For them, love is not warmth, encouragement, or gentle regard. Love is a glance laced with disappointment, an embrace withheld, a word that stings. This child does not merely witness pain, they weave it into the fabric of their identity. When adulthood comes and they begin to choose friends, lovers, or companions, they do not do so in the wide, open field of possibility. They choose within the narrow corridor of the familiar, repeating the pattern because it feels like home. And home, even when burning, feels safer than the wilderness of the unknown. The nervous system, shaped in those early years, learns to equate repetition with safety. A child who endured neglect may find comfort in neglect not because neglect is kind, but because neglect is predictable. The nervous system whispers, "I know this terrain. I have walked it before. I survived." Freedom, the possibility of a new and healthier bond, brings with it the trembling of uncertainty. And to the psyche, uncertainty can feel more threatening than pain. Imagine a woman who, as a child, was constantly belittled by her father. She grows into adulthood, meeting men who echo this pattern, men who dismiss her, overlook her, diminish her worth. And though part of her cries out against it, another part leans toward it almost instinctively. She does not seek pain consciously, but her psyche repeats the script it knows by heart. In the strange arithmetic of the unconscious, suffering feels safer than freedom, because freedom has no map. This is why so many remain entangled with those who cause them suffering. It is not always weakness, nor a lack of self-respect. It is the deep and ancient pull of the psyche toward repetition. In repeating what is known, we attempt, without realizing it, to resolve what was once unbearable. Every repetition carries with it the hope that this time it will end differently, that this time the coldness will warm, the criticism will soften, the dismissal will turn into recognition. But more often than not, the cycle continues, because the partners we choose are drawn from the same soil as the wounds we carry. The poet once wrote that man is more faithful to his habits than to his gods, and habits of the heart are the most stubborn of all. Think of someone who longs for tenderness, yet consistently finds themselves in relationships where tenderness is absent. They may confess their suffering, they may weep over their fate, and yet when a gentle soul appears, someone who offers patience, kindness, and steady regard, they recoil. They may say, it feels strange. I don't feel the spark. What they call lack of spark is, in truth, the discomfort of health. They cannot yet receive what they have never known, and so they return to the familiar flame, even if it scorches them. There is a strange loyalty in the human heart toward its first teachers of love, even when those teachers wounded more than they nurtured. To betray the familiar feels like betraying one's origin, one's blood, even one's very self. Many adults unconsciously protect the image of their parents or caretakers by repeating the pain rather than admitting that the love they received was incomplete or distorted. It is easier to suffer in silence than to face the abyss of that truth. But this fidelity to suffering has a cost. It keeps the individual bound in cycles of repetition that choke growth. The spirit longs for expansion, yet it cannot spread its wings while circling the same dark orbit. And still, the pull is strong, because the unknown is not simply a blank canvas, it is a threat to the ego's stability. To step into the unknown requires the death of old certainties, and death of any kind, even symbolic, frightens the soul. Yet there are those moments when the psyche begins to awaken, when the repetition grows unbearable. A woman who once tolerated dismissiveness wakes up one morning and feels the weight of all her uncried tears. A man who once accepted cruelty recognizes in the mirror the deep weariness of his own spirit. These moments of recognition are often born in despair, but they carry within them the seed of transformation. For in that recognition, the individual begins to glimpse that what feels like safety is, in truth, imprisonment, and so the question arises, can we learn to walk into freedom, even though it feels like terror? Can we risk the trembling of uncertainty for the possibility of a life not ruled by repetition? This is the task of growth, not merely to reject suffering, but to embrace the unknown as a sacred threshold. Psychologists who study attachment have found that individuals raised in chaotic households often repeat those patterns in adulthood. The data confirms what myth and story have long known, that we are drawn to reenact the dramas of our past. But the same studies also show that transformation is possible. With awareness, with reflection, and sometimes with the guidance of others, people can learn to create new patterns of attachment patterns not rooted in fear, but in trust. This is no small task. To step away from familiar pain is to risk loneliness, confusion, and vulnerability. It is to walk without the map we have always used, but it is also to open ourselves to a new horizon. And perhaps this is the paradox of the human journey, that freedom always begins in fear, but ends in growth. So long as we mistake pain for home, we will remain bound to it. But once we begin to see clearly, to name the pattern, to recognize that familiarity is not the same as safety, then the chain begins to loosen. We may still stumble back into the old cycles, but each time we awaken more quickly. And one day, with trembling hands, we choose differently. We walk away from the flame that burns and step into the uncharted air of freedom. And though that air may feel strange at first, though it may chill us with its uncertainty, slowly the lungs begin to expand. Slowly the heart begins to learn that love need not wound to be real, and in that moment what was once terrifying becomes the very ground of healing. The illusion of redemption is one of the deepest snares of the human soul. Beneath the conscious mind, there often lives a child still longing to turn rejection into acceptance, indifference into tenderness, coldness into warmth. Somewhere within, that child whispers, "If I can make this person love me, then at last I will be whole. If I can melt their hardness, if I can prove my worth, then the emptiness of my past will finally be filled." This whisper is not loud, but it is persistent. it shapes choices, it lures us toward relationships that echo our earliest wounds, and it keeps us bound to those who inflict pain. This longing to redeem suffering by transforming it into love is in truth a noble impulse gone astray. At its root, it is not born of weakness but of a profound desire for healing. We wish to complete what was left unfinished, to rewrite the story that shaped us. The neglected child wishes to be chosen. The scorned child wishes to be valued. The abandoned child longs to be held. To encounter someone who wounds us in ways eerily familiar to those early experiences feels, to the unconscious, like an opportunity. If I can make this person see me, then the wound will finally close. The psyche believes that through endurance and devotion, the past can be redeemed. But what often happens is not redemption, but repetition. Our devotion does not soften the one who wounds us. Rather, it deepens the cycle. The more we try to earn love from one who withholds it, the more we affirm the original wound. It is as though we are reenacting the very drama that broke us, hoping for a different ending, yet finding ourselves trapped in the same scene again and again. The stage changes, the actors wear new faces, but the story remains the same. Think of the person who stays with a partner who belittles them, convinced that their steadfast love will eventually awaken tenderness. Each insult is met not with departure but with greater effort, greater sacrifice, greater hope. If I just love harder, they will change. They tell themselves, years pass and the change does not come. What binds them is no longer love, but the dream of redemption, the desperate belief that this suffering must lead somewhere, that it cannot be meaningless. To give up that hope feels like abandoning the child within, the one who still waits for a different ending. This is why leaving such a bond can feel nearly impossible. It is not only the person we fear losing, but the dream itself. To walk away is to admit that redemption may never arrive in the form we imagined, that the wound of the past cannot be erased by making another love us. And so many choose to remain, clinging to the cruel comfort of the dream rather than facing the grief of its collapse. There is also a certain pride hidden in the illusion of redemption. We believe that through our efforts, our endurance, and our love, we can transform another. We imagine ourselves as healers, saviors, the ones who can succeed where others have failed. This pride disguises itself as devotion, but beneath it lies the fear that if this person does not change for us, then perhaps we were never worthy to begin with. Thus, we keep pouring ourselves into the vessel of their indifference, hoping to prove to ourselves that we are enough. Yet the truth is that no amount of love can force another to confront their own wounds. No amount of endurance can awaken a heart unwilling to open. Transformation must come from within, and when we sacrifice ourselves upon the altar of another's potential, we betray the very love we long to give. What we call redemption becomes self-destruction. Still, the illusion persists because it gives suffering meaning. To believe that our pain is shaping something greater makes it bearable. The woman who endures her partner's coldness consoles herself with the thought that one day he will awaken to her worth, and all the years of struggle will be vindicated. The man who tolerates disdain convinces himself that his loyalty will eventually inspire respect. These beliefs turn misery into a kind of pilgrimage. Each wound endured is another step toward the holy moment when everything changes. Without this belief, suffering appears meaningless, and meaningless suffering is the heaviest burden the human heart can bear. But there is another way to see it. The true redemption of suffering does not come from changing another, it comes from awakening within ourselves. The beloved who refuses to soften may never change, but the one who clings, who suffers, who hopes against hope that one has the chance to awaken. To recognize at last that the redemption we seek cannot be given by another, but must be found in the acceptance of our own worth, to stop asking, "What must I do to be loved?" and to begin declaring, "I am already worthy of love." When we release the illusion that suffering must lead to redemption through another, grief comes, a grief as heavy as stone, because we are forced to acknowledge that the past cannot be rewritten in this way. The child within us will not be healed by making another person different, but beyond that grief lies liberation. No longer bound to the impossible task of transforming another, we are free to seek relationships rooted not in repetition, but in truth. We can finally see that love does not need to be earned through suffering, and that devotion does not mean self-erasure. The illusion of redemption is seductive because it promises that our wounds can be healed without facing them directly. It tells us that if we can just make another change, we can avoid the painful work of turning inward, of meeting the broken places within ourselves. But in truth, the only redemption possible is the one born of self-knowledge. When we dare to confront our wounds, to grieve what was denied, and to affirm our worth apart from another's approval, then we are no longer at the mercy of those who wound us. To cling to the hope of changing another is to remain a prisoner of the past. To release that hope is to step into the unknown, where the possibility of genuine love awaits. And though it feels like loss, it is in fact the beginning of healing, the kind of healing that does not depend on anyone else's awakening, but on our own. The shadow within us is perhaps the most unsettling truth to confront, for it shatters the comforting illusion that all suffering comes from outside. It is easier to believe that the cruelty of others is the sole cause of our pain, easier to point the finger outward than to look inward and ask what part of me resonates with this wound. Yet the deeper we go into the labyrinth of the human psyche, the clearer it becomes that those who hurt us often serve as mirrors. They reflect back to us the unresolved conflicts, the hidden doubts, the disowned fragments of ourselves that we have long pushed into the shadows. To encounter betrayal, rejection, or humiliation in another is also to brush against the echo of those same forces already alive within our own inner world. A partner who makes us feel not good enough may indeed be cruel, but the cruelty finds purchase in us because it awakens a voice that was already whispering inside. A friend who betrays our trust does not only wound us with their disloyalty, their act reverberates with an inner suspicion we may have carried for years. I am not worthy of loyalty. I am not someone who can be trusted fully. In this way, painful relationships serve as unbidden teachers, showing us aspects of ourselves we would rather deny. We speak of this realm as the shadow, for it is composed of those parts of the self we keep hidden, even from our own awareness. Some of these elements were buried in childhood, when the world around us declared certain feelings, impulses, or needs unacceptable. A child who was scolded for expressing anger may learn to disown that anger, burying it so deeply that as an adult they cannot acknowledge it until it erupts in destructive ways, or until they attract partners who embody the very aggression they themselves suppress. A boy who was mocked for showing tenderness may exile his vulnerability, only to find himself drawn to people who trample over softness, reinforcing the lesson that tenderness has no safe place in the world. The shadow does not vanish simply because we ignore it. It lingers waiting for expression, and if we refuse to meet it consciously, it often arrives wearing the face of another. We meet our shadow in the cruel partner, in the unreliable friend, in the domineering colleague. These people do not create our wounds. Though they may deepen them, they reveal what has remained unresolved within. Take, for example, a man who consistently chooses controlling partners. He tells himself that he has been unlucky, that fate has cursed him with domineering souls. Yet if he dares to look inward, he may see that it is not luck at all, but the echo of his own unhealed fears of abandonment. His longing to never be left drives him into the arms of those who restrict and dominate, because his unconscious believes that control is the only way to guarantee presence. The partner becomes a mirror, reflecting the terror he carries but has never named. This recognition is painful because it strips away the comfort of victimhood. To see that we are participants in our own suffering is to face responsibility, not blame, but responsibility. It is to admit that part of us unconsciously seeks out what we most fear, because the psyche longs for wholeness. The psyche wants to bring the shadow into the light, and so it draws us again and again into relationships that reflect what we have hidden. We call this repetition bad luck, but at a deeper level it is the self trying to reveal itself to us. Consider how often people describe feeling triggered by another. A word, a look, a gesture unleashes a storm of pain disproportionate to the moment. This is the shadow rising. The other person has touched a nerve that was already raw, exposing a wound carried within. To rail against the trigger alone is to miss the deeper invitation to ask what part of me is still bleeding, and why have I left it unattended for so long? The shadow is not only made of wounds, it also holds unlived potential, buried talents, and repressed desires. Sometimes we cling to those who make us suffer because they awaken not only our fears, but also the vitality we have denied ourselves. The jealous friend who undermines us may be pointing toward our own fear of stepping fully into our power. The dismissive partner may mirror the part of us that refuses to honor our own worth. What we hate in another often reveals what we secretly hate in ourselves, and what we long for in another often reveals what we have yet to cultivate within. It is important to see this clearly. Acknowledging our shadow does not mean excusing the harm others inflict. Cruelty remains cruelty, betrayal remains betrayal. But when we refuse to see our participation in these patterns, we become chained to them. We leave our power in the hands of others, waiting for them to change while the deeper work remains undone. To turn toward the shadow is to reclaim that power to say, yes, I was wounded. Yes, others have harmed me, but I also carry within me the seeds of these wounds, and until I meet them, I will continue to circle the same pain. Think of the countless times we hear someone say, "Why do I always end up with the same kind of person?" This lament is not just about the cruelty of others. It is a signpost pointing inward. Until we see what is being mirrored back, until we recognize the shadow within us, the cycle will continue. The face will change, but the wound will remain. To confront the shadow is not a simple task. It requires courage to look into the mirror another holds up to us and to say, "This is not only about them. This is also about me." It requires the humility to accept that parts of us we have disowned are still alive, shaping our choices, whispering in our decisions. And it requires compassion, for the shadow was not born of malice but of survival. We buried these parts of ourselves because at one time we believed it was the only way to be loved, the only way to be safe. When we bring the shadow into awareness, something extraordinary happens. The cruel partner no longer feels like fate, but like a signal pointing us back to our own unhealed places. The betraying friend no longer defines our worth, but illuminates the part of us that still doubts it. Each painful encounter becomes not just suffering but revelation, a chance to see more of who we are, to integrate what was once hidden. This does not mean we should remain with those who wound us. On the contrary, it means we can leave them not in bitterness, but with clarity, we can say, "I see what this has shown me, and I choose differently now." In this way, the shadow ceases to control us from below, and instead becomes a guide toward wholeness. The shadow within us is not an enemy to be destroyed, but a teacher to be acknowledged. And when we dare to face it, we discover that those who hurt us are not only tormentors but also unwilling messengers, carrying fragments of our own soul back to us. To accept that truth is painful, but it is also the first step toward freedom, for no longer are we bound by blindness. We begin, at last, to see ourselves fully. Loneliness is one of the most primal fears of the human soul, and it is a fear that often binds us more powerfully than chains of iron. Many people endure mistreatment, cruelty, and silence within relationships, not because they do not recognize the suffering, but because the thought of being alone seems even more unbearable. To sit in a room with no voice to answer, no presence to fill the space, no gaze to acknowledge us, this emptiness can feel like annihilation. And so, even when love has curdled into pain, many cling to it as though to let go would be to step into a void from which there is no return. A toxic relationship often whispers in the night, "At least you are not alone. At least someone sees you, even if their seeing wounds you. At least there is a hand, even if it strikes more often than it soothes. At least there is a voice, even if it belittles instead of comforts." The heart, terrified of silence, convinces itself that cruelty is preferable to absence. Better to feel the sting of disdain than the hollow ache of being unseen. And so countless people remain bound to suffering, not because they cannot walk away, but because the prospect of walking into emptiness seems like death itself. This fear is not without reason. From our earliest days, survival depended on connection. An infant cannot live without the gaze of its caregiver, without arms to hold, without a voice to soothe. Loneliness for the child is not an inconvenience, it is a threat to existence. And though we grow into adults, part of us still carries that ancient terror. To be alone is to be abandoned, and to be abandoned is to perish. That primitive fear lingers in the depths of the psyche, often hidden, but quick to rise whenever we face separation. Consider the woman who endures years in an abusive marriage. When asked why she does not leave, she speaks not only of financial dependence or fear of retaliation, but of the terror of being utterly alone. To lie in an empty bed, to wake with no one beside her, to go unacknowledged day after day, this feels more unbearable than insults, more unbearable even than bruises. The cruelty she knows feels safer than the void she imagines. Research on abusive relationships confirms this. Many victims remain not only out of fear for safety or financial security, but because the thought of complete isolation terrifies them more than the pain they already know. The psyche, in its hunger for connection, can make strange bargains. It will whisper, "Better the cold company of cruelty than the silence of no company at all. Better to suffer and at least be tethered, than to drift untethered into the abyss of solitude." And so, we mistake chains for lifelines, mistaking the presence of another, however harmful, for proof that we still exist. But what is it that makes loneliness feel so unbearable? It is not merely the absence of others, but the confrontation with ourselves. When the voices fall silent and the room grows empty, we are left face with the unmediated presence of our own being, and for many this is the most terrifying encounter of all. We would rather be distracted by the drama of a toxic relationship than sit in the raw presence of our own solitude. The cruelty of another can keep us occupied. It fills our thoughts, it stirs our emotions, it gives us a story to live within. But in the absence of another, there is no distraction, only the vast silence of the self, and the questions it brings. Who am I when no one is watching? Am I worthy if no one affirms me? Do I exist if no one sees me? To avoid these questions, many endure suffering in silence. They choose the familiar torment over the abyss of solitude. It is not because they are weak, but because they are human. To stand alone requires a courage that feels unnatural, almost superhuman, for it asks us to trust in our own worth without external confirmation. It asks us to believe in our own existence without another's gaze to anchor it. Yet within this fear lies a paradox. Loneliness, though terrifying, can also become the very crucible in which transformation begins. When we finally dare to face the emptiness we dread, we discover that it is not emptiness at all, but a space filled with possibility. What first appears as absence can become presence, the presence of our own soul, which has long been overshadowed by the noise of toxic connections. But this truth cannot be known until we endure the passage through fear. Think of those who have walked away from relationships that once defined them, even though it meant nights of silence, days of aching solitude. In the beginning, they felt as though they were unraveling, as though the very fabric of their being was dissolving in the absence of another. But slowly in that silence, they began to hear a different voice, not the voice of cruelty, not the echo of belittlement, but the quiet voice of their own spirit. And in hearing it, they began to realize that they were never truly alone, for within them lived a depth of being that no absence could erase. But this path is not simple, nor is it without suffering. To step into solitude is to confront grief, the grief of letting go of the hope that someone else will complete us, the grief of acknowledging the time lost in relationships that drained rather than nourished us. It is to sit with the ache of absence and to resist the urge to fill it too quickly with another presence, for unless the emptiness is faced, the cycle will repeat. Yet, if we can remain, if we can endure the silence without running, we discover that loneliness is not a punishment, but a passage, a narrow gate, through which the soul must walk to discover its own strength. Loneliness teaches us that our worth is not dependent on another's gaze. It strips us of illusions and demands that we anchor ourselves in our own being. It teaches us to differentiate between the mere presence of another body and the presence of true companionship. For what is the use of lying beside someone who diminishes us when our spirit cries out for recognition? Better the honest solitude of an empty room than the loneliness of being unseen in another's arms. The fear of loneliness keeps countless people bound to suffering, yet loneliness itself is not the enemy. The enemy is our refusal to face it, our insistence on filling it at any cost. When we learn to meet loneliness as a teacher, it transforms. What once felt like annihilation becomes revelation. We begin to see that solitude can be fertile ground, a place where the seeds of selfhood take root, a space where we can learn to hear our own voice without distortion. And so, the fear that once enslaved us can become the doorway to freedom. To walk through that fear is to claim our own existence without need of another to confirm it. To embrace solitude is to discover that we are not empty, but whole. And when we emerge from that crucible, we are no longer bound by the desperate need to cling to those who hurt us, for we have learned that even in silence, even in absence, we are never truly alone. Suffering, though unwelcome, carries within it a hidden summons, a quiet but insistent call to transformation. Though we often resist it, though we curse it and wish it away, suffering has the power to strip away illusions and bring us face with the truths we have long avoided. When we are bound to someone who wounds us, the pain does not simply gnaw at our hearts. It presses questions upon us, questions that cut to the marrow of our being. Who am I, really, beyond what others say I am? What do I deserve in this life? How much pain am I willing to endure before I finally awaken to my own worth? These questions are not gentle. They arrive like thunder, demanding answers, shaking the very foundations of our lives. To suffer in a relationship is to live in a crucible. The fire of that bond burns away our defenses, and in the ashes we are forced to see ourselves more clearly. A person who is betrayed must decide, will I continue to see myself as unworthy of loyalty, or will I rise into the truth that I am worthy of devotion? One who is diminished again and again must decide, will I accept this smallness as my fate, or will I claim the vastness of who I really am? The relationship that causes pain becomes more than a wound. It becomes a mirror, urging us to awaken to the parts of ourselves we have left unseen. This is why so many, when they finally step away from toxic love, describe the experience not only as loss, but as rebirth. They speak of discovering themselves for the first time, as though beneath the layers of suffering their true essence had been waiting, hidden but intact. It was only when I finally left, many say, that I discovered who I truly was. The pain was the teacher, the relationship the crucible, and freedom the rebirth. There is a strange paradox in the way the soul grows. We rarely change in moments of ease, for ease lulls us into complacency. It is suffering that compels us to ask deeper questions, to break the cycles we would otherwise repeat endlessly. Without the fire of pain, many would never awaken to the truth that they deserve more than they have been given. Pain, then, becomes not only an affliction, but also an initiation, a threshold we must cross in order to claim our lives. Think of the woman who spent years with a partner who belittled her. At first, she tried to adapt, to please, to prove her worth. She twisted herself into shapes, hoping one day he would soften. But instead, his disdain grew sharper, his contempt more cutting. One day, she caught her reflection in the mirror and hardly recognized herself, eyes dimmed, shoulders slumped, her laughter silenced. In that moment of recognition, the pain became unbearable, but it also became transformative. She asked herself the questions she had long avoided. Do I wish to live like this until the end of my days? Do I not deserve to be seen, cherished, loved? In choosing to walk away, she did not merely leave him, she left behind the old story of unworthiness that had held her captive since childhood. She stepped into the unknown, trembling but alive, and slowly she began to reclaim her laughter, her voice, her light. This is the call to transformation, the realization that suffering is not an endpoint, but an invitation to choose differently. Yet the call is not easy to answer. Transformation always demands a kind of death, the death of who we thought we were, the death of the illusions we clung to, the death of the patterns that once kept us safe. To let go of a toxic bond is to grieve not only the person, but also the dream we built around them, the hope that one day they would become the answer to our wounds. It is to stand naked before the unknown and to trust that in losing what hurt us, we will find what heals us. The soul resists this, for it prefers the certainty of familiar pain to the uncertainty of freedom. And yet freedom cannot come without passing through that valley of grief. When we finally answer the call to transformation, something shifts within us. We stop seeing ourselves only as victims of another's cruelty, and begin to recognize the agency of our own choice. We realize that to reject suffering is not merely to turn away from someone else, it is to affirm our own worth. It is to declare, sometimes for the first time, I will no longer inherit the wounds of the past. I will no longer repeat the story written for me by others. I choose freedom over repetition. I choose myself. This choice reverberates not only through our own lives but through generations. Many who have broken free from toxic love speak of how their children, their families, their communities begin to shift as well. The courage of one soul to step out of suffering lights a path for others to follow. Pain that once threatened to consume us becomes, in retrospect, the very fire that forged us. It is tempting to look back on suffering only with bitterness, to wish it had never happened. And indeed, no one deserves cruelty, no one deserves betrayal. But when we see with deeper eyes, we may recognize that suffering, though brutal, can serve a higher purpose. It exposes illusions, forces us into honesty, and beckons us toward a fuller life. Without it, many of us would never have discovered the strength that lay hidden in our depths, the courage we did not know we possessed. The call to transformation is quiet at first, often drowned out by fear and denial. But the longer we remain in suffering, the louder it becomes. Eventually, it demands to be heard. Some will resist it until the very end, clinging to pain rather than risking change. But for those who dare to answer, suffering becomes the doorway to a truer existence. And so, when we ask why we cling to those who make us suffer, we must also see that within this clinging lies the possibility of awakening. Every cruel word, every betrayal, every moment of silence that breaks the heart, all of these can become mirrors, urging us to ask the questions we have long avoided. Who am I? What do I deserve? What am I willing to endure? And in answering, we discover that we are not powerless. We can choose, we can walk away, we can be reborn. To embrace this truth is to transform suffering from meaningless pain into sacred fire. It is to see that even in the darkest bond, there is an invitation to awaken. The pain does not define us, but what we choose in response to it does. And in that choice lies the seed of transformation, the seed of freedom, the seed of a life no longer bound by repetition, but opened to the vastness of who we truly are. So why do we cling to those who make us suffer? Because suffering feels familiar, because we dream of redemption, because our shadow is reflected in them, because we fear loneliness, and because pain, in its strange way, can lead us toward transformation. But here is the truth. We are not meant to be prisoners of our past, nor servants of our wounds. To awaken is to recognize that suffering may visit us, but we need not invite it to stay. When we finally dare to let go of those who harm us, we do not merely lose, we gain. We gain the chance to love without fear, to stand without chains, and to become the person we were always meant to be.